Elena Vasquez had been walking for 3 days through the Wyoming blizzard with nothing but a torn shawl and boots so worn that her toes had gone numb on the first morning. Her lips cracked and bleeding from the wind that howled across the open prairie like the screams of every ghost she had left behind in Santa Fe. When the cowboy found her, she was on her hands and knees in a snowdrift 2 miles from the nearest ranch, her dark hair frozen to her face in sheets of ice, and she no longer remembered her own name or why she had believed she could survive the January crossing of 1881, when even the Shoshone had retreated to their winter camps and refused to travel. She could not stand anymore. Her legs had given out an hour before dawn, and when she tried to crawl forward, her hands disappeared into snow so deep it might as well have been her grave already being dug by the storm itself. The cowboy lifted her from that drift, his strong arms pulling her up from what would have been her frozen tomb, and in that single moment of mercy, he set in motion a reckoning that the West would never forgive him for, because salvation and damnation often wear the same face on the frontier, and the line between heroism and betrayal is sometimes nothing more than the color of the skin of the woman you choose to save. If you are drawn to stories where one act of humanity can destroy a man's entire world, where mercy becomes a crime and compassion a sentence, subscribe now, because what happens next will force you to question everything you believe about courage and the brutal price of doing what is right when the world demands you do what is easy. The cowboy's name was Jacob Mercer, and he was 34 years old that frozen morning when he found Elena collapsed in the snow. He had been riding fence line for the Triple Bar Ranch, checking for breaks caused by the blizzard that had been pounding the territory for 5 straight days, when his horse suddenly stopped and refused to move forward. Despite Jacob's urging, the animal's ears were pricked forward, its nostrils flaring, and Jacob had learned long ago to trust a horse's instincts more than his own. He dismounted and walked ahead, leading the reluctant animal, and that was when he saw what looked like a dark bundle half buried in the white expanse. For a moment, he thought it might be a dead elk, or perhaps a lost calf from one of the herds. But as he approached, he saw the hand, small and brown, reaching up from the snow as if grasping for something that would never come. Jacob ran the last 20 yards and dropped to his knees beside her, brushing the snow from her face with his gloved hands. And when her eyes fluttered open, they were the darkest eyes he had ever seen, filled not with hope, but with the kind of resignation that comes from knowing you are about to die and being almost grateful for it. She could not stand anymore. When he tried to help her to her feet, her legs buckled and she collapsed against him. So he lifted her in his arms the way a man might carry his bride across a threshold, except this threshold was the line between life and death, and he was carrying her away from the latter, even though he did not yet understand what crossing that line would cost him. Jacob got Elena onto his horse and climbed up behind her, holding her against his chest to share what warmth his body could provide as he turned the animal toward the Triple Bar headquarters 6 miles to the east. The wind screamed at them the entire ride, throwing snow that felt like needles against his exposed face, and Elena drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering in Spanish words he could not understand, but which sounded like prayers or perhaps accusations. When they finally reached the ranch, it was past noon, and the hands who came running from the bunkhouse stopped dead in their tracks when they saw what Jacob was carrying. A Mexican woman, half frozen, being lifted down from his saddle with a gentleness that made the watching men exchange glances that Jacob was too cold and tired to interpret in that moment. He carried Elena into the main house, pushing through the door without knocking, and Mrs. Sarah Hendricks, the ranch owner's wife, looked up from her knitting with an expression of shock that quickly shifted to something harder when she saw the brown face of the woman in Jacob's arms. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the fire in the stone hearth and the wind howling outside like something alive and hungry. Mrs. Hendricks was a practical woman who had survived 2 decades on the frontier by knowing which battles to fight and which to avoid. And after that frozen moment, she made a decision that would later haunt her. She pointed to the small room off the kitchen where they sometimes housed injured hands, and Jacob carried Elena there, laying her on the narrow bed while Mrs. Hendricks brought blankets and hot water. Together, they worked to save her, stripping off the frozen clothes and wrapping her in wool, forcing warm broth between her cracked lips and rubbing her blue fingers and toes to restore circulation. Elena's eyes opened several times during this process, and each time they found Jacob's face, and something passed between them that neither could have named, but which both recognized as the kind of debt that can never be fully repaid. By nightfall, her breathing had steadied, and the blue tinge had left her lips, and Mrs. Hendricks pronounced that she would likely live, though 2 of her toes would probably have to come off due to frostbite. Jacob sat in a chair beside the bed long after Mrs. Hendricks had gone back to her own rooms, watching Elena sleep, and he did not yet understand that he was guarding more than just an injured woman. He was guarding his own future, and the future was already beginning to slip away like water through his fingers. The trouble started the next morning when Ben Hendricks, the ranch owner, returned from Cheyenne where he had been stuck by the blizzard for 3 days. He was a thick man with a red face and hands that were scarred from years of hard work. And when he heard that Jacob had brought a Mexican woman to the ranch house and that she was currently sleeping in the spare room, his face went from red to purple. The argument that followed could be heard throughout the house, with Ben shouting that Jacob had no right to bring that woman here, that she was probably running from something or someone, that harboring her could bring trouble they did not need, and that she needed to be moved to the bunkhouse, or better yet, sent on her way to wherever she had been going. Jacob stood his ground, his voice quiet but firm, saying that moving her would kill her, that Christian charity demanded they care for her until she was well enough to travel, and that he would take full responsibility for her presence. The argument ended with Ben storming out and slamming the door so hard that the windows rattled, and Jacob knew in that moment that something had shifted, that the easy relationship he had enjoyed with his employer for 6 years had developed a crack that might never fully heal. Over the next week, as the blizzard finally exhausted itself and the sky cleared to a blue so bright it hurt to look at it, Elena slowly recovered. The doctor who came out from the small town of Medicine Bow confirmed that 2 toes on her left foot were too far gone and amputated them in the spare room while Jacob waited outside, his hands clenched so tight that his knuckles went white. When it was over and Elena's foot was bandaged, the doctor pulled Jacob aside and asked him what his intentions were regarding the woman. Because there would be talk, there was always talk, and a white cowboy helping a Mexican woman was the kind of thing that people would make assumptions about, assumptions that could be dangerous for both of them. Jacob did not have an answer to that question because he himself did not know what his intentions were. He only knew that when he looked at Elena, he felt something he had not felt in years, something that might have been responsibility or might have been something else entirely, and the not knowing was almost as frightening as the knowing would have been. Elena's story emerged slowly over those weeks of recovery, shared in fragments of broken English and Spanish that Jacob pieced together like a puzzle. She had been married to a man named Carlos who worked in the silver mines near Santa Fe, and they had a daughter, a little girl named Maria who was 7 years old. Carlos had been killed in a mining accident, crushed by falling rock, and the mine owners had given Elena nothing, no compensation, no pension, nothing but the body of her husband and a week to clear out of the company housing. She had heard that there was work in the north, in the Wyoming territory, work in the hotels and restaurants that were springing up along the new railroad lines, and she had scraped together enough money for a train ticket that would take her to Cheyenne. But the train had broken down 2 days outside of Santa Fe, and the railroad had put all the passengers on a stagecoach to continue north, and the stage had been caught in the blizzard, and the driver had lost his way and finally abandoned the coach and the passengers, taking the horses and leaving everyone to fend for themselves. Elena had started walking with several others, but one by one they had given up or wandered off in different directions, and eventually she had been alone, walking through a white wilderness that all looked the same in every direction. She had left her daughter Maria with her sister in Santa Fe, planning to send for her once she had found work and a place to live, and now she wept when she thought about Maria, about whether her sister could afford to keep feeding another mouth, about whether she would ever see her daughter again. Jacob listened to all of this and felt something inside him that he had thought died when his own wife had passed from fever 3 years earlier. He had loved Mary with the kind of love that young men feel, certain and uncomplicated, and when she died, he had believed that part of him died with her. But sitting beside Elena's bed, listening to her broken voice describe her broken life, he felt that dead part stir, and he was not sure if he should be grateful or terrified. The other hands on the ranch noticed the hours he spent in that room, and they noticed the way he looked at Elena, and they began to whisper among themselves in the bunkhouse at night. Some of them were sympathetic, understanding that a man could be lonely and that loneliness did not care about the color of skin, but others were less charitable, muttering about Mexicans and how they were taking work from Americans, how they could not be trusted, how Jacob was making a fool of himself over a woman who would probably rob him blind and disappear the moment she was strong enough to walk. The tension on the Triple Bar Ranch grew thicker than the snow had been. Ben Hendricks made it clear through Mrs. Hendricks that Elena needed to leave as soon as she could travel, and he stopped speaking directly to Jacob, communicating only through curt notes and messages delivered by other hands. The crew split into factions, with some supporting Jacob and others making increasingly ugly comments about Elena and what they assumed was happening between her and Jacob. Nothing was happening. Jacob slept in the bunkhouse, and Elena remained in the spare room under Mrs. Hendricks' watchful eye. But the truth did not matter when men had already decided what they wanted to believe. By the time February arrived and the worst of the winter had passed, the situation had become untenable, and Jacob knew that a choice was coming. He could feel it approaching, like another storm on the horizon. The choice arrived on a Sunday morning when Jacob walked into the small church in Medicine Bow and found the preacher waiting for him with a delegation of townspeople. They did not waste time with pleasantries. They told Jacob directly that his actions were causing problems, that the presence of the Mexican woman at the Triple Bar was inappropriate, that people were talking, and the talk was damaging not just Jacob's reputation, but the reputation of the entire community. They suggested, in terms that were barely polite, that Elena should be sent away, perhaps put on a train to somewhere else, anywhere else, because her presence was upsetting the natural order of things. Jacob listened to all of this with his hat in his hands and his face expressionless, and when they finished, he asked them a single question. He asked if any of them had ever found another human being dying in the snow, and if so, what they had done about it. The silence that followed was answer enough, and Jacob put his hat back on and walked out of the church, and he did not return, not that Sunday or any Sunday after. The final breaking came in early March when Ben Hendricks told Jacob that he needed to make a choice. The Mexican woman left or Jacob left, and there was no third option. Jacob asked for a day to think about it, and Ben gave him until the next morning. That night, Jacob sat with Elena in the spare room, and they talked for hours about what should happen next. Elena told him that she did not want to be the cause of him losing his job, that she could go to Medicine Bow and find work there, or she could try to make it to Cheyenne on her own, now that the weather had improved. But Jacob could see in her eyes that she was terrified of being alone again, of facing the world without anyone to help her, and he knew that sending her away would be condemning her to the same slow death he had saved her from in the snow, just a different kind of death, one that would take longer but would be no less certain. And so Jacob made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He told Elena that they would leave together, that he would take her to Cheyenne and help her find work, and then he would continue north to Montana, where he had heard there were ranches that did not care as much about a man's associations as long as he could do the work. Elena protested, saying he was throwing away 6 years of steady employment for a woman he barely knew. But Jacob cut her off and told her something he had not planned to say, that she was not a stranger anymore, that somewhere between pulling her from the snow and sitting beside her bed, he had come to care about what happened to her, and that maybe caring about another person was reason enough to make a difficult choice. Pause here. What would you have done in Jacob's place? Would you have sent Elena away to protect your livelihood and your standing in the community? Or would you have sacrificed everything you had built for the sake of a woman society told you did not deserve your help? Drop your truth in the comments, because this question has no easy answer, and the choice Jacob made echoes through every moment that follows. They left the Triple Bar Ranch before dawn the next morning, riding double on Jacob's horse, with their few possessions tied in bedrolls behind the saddle. Mrs. Hendricks had given Elena some of her old clothes and a small purse with $20 in it, a gesture of kindness that she had hidden from her husband, and she stood at the kitchen window watching them ride away with tears running down her face, because she understood what it meant, what Jacob was giving up, what Elena had already lost, and what the world would do to both of them for daring to defy the unwritten rules that governed life on the frontier. The ride to Cheyenne took 4 days, and along the way, they stopped at small ranches and farms where Jacob would ask for work, and more often than not, the door would be closed in his face when people saw Elena sitting on the horse behind him. They spent their nights camped under the stars, and Jacob taught Elena more English, and she taught him more Spanish. And slowly, they built something between them that might have been friendship or might have been the beginning of something deeper, though neither dared to name it, because naming it would make it real, and making it real would make it even more dangerous than it already was. In Cheyenne, Jacob helped Elena find a job at a small hotel near the railroad depot, work cleaning rooms, and doing laundry, and he found work for himself at a livery stable owned by a man who did not care about gossip or scandal, only about whether a man knew his way around horses. They lived in separate boarding houses on opposite sides of town, maintaining a careful distance that they hoped would protect them from the worst of the talk. But the talk came anyway. People had seen them arrive together, had seen Jacob helping Elena find work and a place to live, and in the saloons and shops of Cheyenne, the story grew with each telling until Jacob Mercer became the cowboy who had abandoned his position for a Mexican woman, who had thrown away his reputation and his future for someone the town decided was not worth such a sacrifice. Jacob found that men he had known for years would no longer acknowledge him on the street, that the stable owner had to explain repeatedly to customers that yes, the man working there was trustworthy despite the stories they might have heard, and that doors he had once walked through freely were now closed to him. For Elena, the situation was even more difficult. The other women who worked at the hotel made it clear that she was not welcome in their company, and they would not eat their meals with her or speak to her unless absolutely necessary for work. The hotel owner, a severe woman named Mrs. Patterson, watched Elena constantly, waiting for her to make a mistake that would justify firing her. Though Elena worked harder than any two of the other women combined and never gave Mrs. Patterson the excuse she was looking for. At night, alone, in her small room at the boarding house, Elena would think about her daughter Maria, about the money she was slowly saving to send for her, and about Jacob, about how his act of mercy in lifting her from the snow had cost him everything, and how she would never be able to repay that debt, no matter how long she lived. The months passed, and summer arrived, turning the streets of Cheyenne into rivers of mud when it rained, and into clouds of dust when it did not. Jacob and Elena continued their careful dance, seeing each other occasionally on the street and exchanging brief greetings, maintaining the pretense that they were merely acquaintances when everyone knew they were more than that, though no one could quite define what that more consisted of. Then, on a hot August afternoon, everything changed again. A man arrived in Cheyenne looking for Elena Vasquez, a tall man with a scar on his face and eyes that were as cold as the snow that had nearly killed her. His name was Ramon Torres, and he claimed to be Elena's brother-in-law, the brother of her dead husband Carlos, and he had come to take her back to Santa Fe. When Jacob heard about this, he went immediately to the hotel and found Ramon standing in the lobby with Elena, who looked smaller and more frightened than she had even in the snow. Ramon saw Jacob, and his expression shifted to something ugly, and he asked if this was the man, the white cowboy who had stolen his brother's wife and corrupted her with promises of a better life. Elena started to protest, but Ramon grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks and told her that she was coming with him, that her daughter Maria was sick and crying for her mother every night, and that her sister could not take care of the child anymore. Jacob stepped forward and told Ramon to let go of Elena's arm, and Ramon laughed and said that a white man had no business interfering in Mexican family matters, and besides, Elena was coming willingly, was she not? He looked at Elena with eyes that promised consequences if she said otherwise, and Elena looked at Jacob with eyes that pleaded for help, but also for understanding, because Maria was her daughter, and if Maria was sick, then nothing else mattered, not her job, not her new life, not even Jacob. Jacob understood this because he would have done the same for a child of his own, but he also understood something else. He understood the fear in Elena's eyes when she looked at Ramon, and he knew that something was wrong with the story, that there was more happening here than a concerned uncle coming to bring his niece's mother home. Jacob asked Elena directly if she wanted to go with Ramon, if Maria was truly sick, and Elena's eyes filled with tears, and she started to speak, but Ramon cut her off and said it did not matter what she wanted. She was coming with him, and that was the end of it. What happened next happened fast. Jacob put his hand on Ramon's chest and told him again to let go of Elena's arm. Ramon shoved Jacob backward and reached for something at his belt, and Jacob saw the flash of a knife blade, and in that moment, all the careful distance Jacob had maintained, all the attempts to be respectable and avoid further scandal, all of it vanished, and he did what he should have done months earlier. He hit Ramon hard enough to drop him to the floor of the hotel lobby, the knife skittering away across the wooden boards. And then Jacob pulled Elena behind him and told Ramon that Elena was not going anywhere unless she wanted to go. And if Ramon had a problem with that, then they could settle it outside like men instead of threatening a woman in a hotel lobby. Ramon got slowly to his feet, blood running from his nose, and he smiled a smile that had no humor in it and told Jacob that this was not over, that he had friends in Cheyenne, good friends who did not like seeing Mexicans treated badly by whites, and that Jacob would regret putting his hands on him. The sheriff arrived within minutes, called by Mrs. Patterson, who had watched the entire scene with a mixture of horror and vindication, because now she finally had her reason to fire Elena. The sheriff listened to Ramon's version of events, which painted Jacob as a violent man who had attacked an innocent relative trying to retrieve his dead brother's wife. And then he listened to Jacob's version and to Elena's version, and in the end, he told them all that he did not care about their personal drama, but if there was any more trouble, he would throw everyone involved in jail and sort it out later. Ramon left with a promise to return with proof of his claims about Maria, and Jacob and Elena stood in the empty hotel lobby while Mrs. Patterson informed Elena that her employment was terminated effective immediately and that she had 1 hour to collect her things from the boarding house before she would be considered a trespasser. That night, Jacob and Elena sat in the stable where Jacob worked, surrounded by the smell of hay and horses, and they finally had the conversation they had been avoiding for 6 months. Elena told Jacob the truth about Ramon, that he was indeed Carlos's brother, but that he was also a dangerous man who had wanted to marry Elena himself before Carlos had, and that she suspected the story about Maria being sick was a lie designed to get Elena back to Santa Fe, where Ramon could control her. She had sent letters to her sister and received responses saying that Maria was fine, healthy, and happy, and Elena believed those letters more than she believed anything Ramon said. Jacob asked Elena what she wanted to do, and Elena said she wanted to stay in Cheyenne, wanted to keep saving money to send for Maria, wanted to build a life here, but she also did not want to cause Jacob any more trouble because he had already sacrificed too much for her. Jacob was quiet for a long time, And then he said something that surprised both of them. He said that maybe it was time to stop worrying about what other people thought, that he had spent 6 months trying to be respectable and avoid scandal, and all it had brought him was loneliness and regret, and that if he was going to be condemned for helping Elena, then he might as well be condemned for actually caring about her, instead of just pretending to be a distant acquaintance. The next few weeks were some of the strangest of Jacob's life. Ramon did not return immediately, but his presence haunted them like a shadow, and Jacob began to hear stories around town about men asking questions about him and Elena, about where they lived and worked, and what their relationship was. The livery stable owner, who had been Jacob's only real friend in Cheyenne, told Jacob quietly that he was being pressured to fire him, that certain business owners in town had made it clear that they would take their custom elsewhere if he continued to employ a man who had such poor judgment in his associations. Elena had managed to find new work at a Chinese laundry whose owner did not care about scandal because he faced enough discrimination himself, but the pay was less than half what she had made at the hotel, and her dream of sending for Maria seemed to slip further away with each passing day. Jacob and Elena began to see each other openly, taking meals together at the small Mexican restaurant on the edge of town, and the town responded by treating them like ghosts, people who could be seen but not acknowledged, who occupied space but were not truly part of the community. Then Ramon returned, and he brought friends. There were 4 of them, total hard men with sun-darkened faces and eyes that had seen too much violence to be bothered by the prospect of more. They found Jacob at the stable on a Saturday evening when he was closing up, and they surrounded him in the growing darkness, and Ramon told him that this was his last warning. Elena was coming back to Santa Fe whether she wanted to or not, and Jacob could either stay out of it and keep his life, or he could interfere and lose everything, including whatever future he thought he might have. Jacob asked Ramon why he wanted Elena so badly when she clearly did not want him, and Ramon's answer was chilling in its honesty. He said it was not about Elena, it was about Carlos, his brother, who had won Elena's hand when Ramon had wanted it, who had been the favorite son while Ramon was the disappointment, and now that Carlos was dead, Ramon would claim what should have been his from the beginning. It was about possession and pride, not love, and Ramon would not be denied a second time. Jacob knew he could not win a fight against 4 men, but he also knew he could not let Ramon take Elena without a fight, so he made a choice that was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, depending on how you looked at it. He told Ramon that if he wanted Elena, he would have to kill Jacob first, because Jacob would not stand aside and watch a woman be dragged back to a life she did not want by a man she feared. Ramon laughed and said that could be arranged, and he nodded to one of his friends who pulled a gun and pointed it at Jacob's chest. For a long moment, the stable was silent, except for the nervous movements of the horses who sensed the tension, and Jacob wondered if this was how his story would end. Shot in a stable in Cheyenne over a woman he had known for less than a year, and he decided that if it was, then at least it was a better ending than dying alone and forgotten. But the shot did not come. Instead, a voice from the stable entrance said that whoever pulled that trigger would hang before morning, and everyone turned to see the stable owner standing there with a shotgun cradled in his arms, and 3 other men behind him, local business owners who had decided, apparently, that they were tired of being told who they could and could not employ, who they could and could not associate with, and who deserved protection under the law. The standoff lasted another minute, and then Ramon and his friends backed toward the door. Ramon telling Jacob that this was not over, that he would get what he came for one way or another. But the certainty in his voice had wavered, and when they rode out of Cheyenne that night, they did not return. The West, however, did not forgive Jacob for lifting Elena from the snow. The story of what happened in Cheyenne spread across the territory like wildfire, changing and growing with each telling until Jacob Mercer became a cautionary tale, the cowboy who had thrown away everything for a Mexican woman and nearly gotten himself killed for his trouble. Ranchers who might have hired him years ago now would not even let him on their property, and Jacob realized that his time in Wyoming was finished. He told Elena that they needed to leave, needed to go somewhere where no one knew their story, and Elena agreed. They left Cheyenne on a September morning when the first hints of autumn were in the air, heading north toward Montana on a stagecoach. And the few people who saw them leave did not wave goodbye, because you do not wave to ghosts. You just watch them disappear. They settled eventually in a small town in Montana called Judith Gap, where the land was hard, but the people were harder and cared more about what you could do than who you associated with. Jacob found work on a ranch owned by a widower who did not care about gossip, and Elena found work at the general store. They lived in separate places for a while, maintaining appearances, but eventually they stopped maintaining them because they both understood that sometimes the right choice is not the one that society approves of, but the one that lets you look at yourself in the mirror without shame. They married quietly a year later, and Elena's sister brought Maria north to live with them, and the little girl who had lost her father found a new one in the cowboy who had lifted her mother from the snow. But the story did not end happily ever after, because stories like this never do. Jacob never fully escaped the reputation that followed him from Wyoming, and there were always men who looked at him and Elena and saw something wrong, something that offended their sense of how the world should be ordered. He lost jobs because of it. They were refused service in restaurants and hotels, and their daughter Maria grew up knowing that her family was different, that people whispered about them, and that the price her mother and stepfather paid for being together was a price that never stopped being extracted. The West never forgave Jacob for lifting Elena from the snow, because the West had rules, unwritten but immutable, and Jacob had broken them all for the sake of mercy. He had chosen humanity over tribal loyalty, compassion over conformity, and individual conscience over collective judgment, and the frontier does not easily forgive such transgressions. If you have made it this far, then you understand that this story is not really about Jacob or Elena. It is about the choices we make when the cost of mercy is everything we have, and whether we have the courage to pay that price. What would you have done? Would you have left Elena in the snow to preserve your place in a world that demanded her death? Would you have walked away when the cost became too high? The answer defines who we are, and the West was built on such answers, some of them noble and some of them damning. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit that like button if this story moved you, and subscribe, because there are more tales like this, stories of impossible choices on an unforgiving frontier where the right decision is never the easy one.